Thank you so much for joining our webinar today on enriching the UK and Ireland STEM learning experience in a post-COVID world. My name is Joshua Pine. I work as a marketing manager here at Lobster, and yeah, it's I really want to thank you for taking your time today, and as our panelists as well. It's been a rather crazy year. It was just over a year ago that we had the WHO declare the COVID-19 a global pandemic, and our lives have been affected significantly by this. And I think the development of several vaccines have definitely underlined the importance and power of science. But we also want to take this opportunity to thank you all for your dedication to ensure that we have continuous instruction and teaching going on for our next generation of scientists. So a big thank you to you all. As for the process of today, we will be using a tool called Slido. So if you all could please open up another tab, another window, and go to slido.com/Lobster. So we'll be using this for a poll, but also for you to ask any questions that you have. So once I've gone through a couple of slides, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Sarah Jane. And once she starts, you can ask your questions in Slido, and they'll be put through and they'll be shown on the screen, and the panelists can deal with the questions. So now that we're sort of heading into what we hope is a more normal world, I'm really looking forward to introduce our 5 panelists. We have Dr. Amy Patton from Aston University in Birmingham. We have Dr. Gavin Evans from Manchester Metropolitan University. We have Gavin Knight, Principal Lecturer at Portsmouth University. And we have Dr. Teresa Uniacke-Lowe from University College Cork. And we have our very own Sarah Jane Bolton, Global Curriculum Lead at Lobster. So this is our panel, and I'm really excited to see what discussions that will come up, and also absorb the insights on the lessons and the resources from the past year that they've had to make use of, and also what they'll be bringing with them going forward to providing the students with a richer and more supportive learning environment. So I will just give you the visuals as well. They've all been very kind and waved, but I'll give you some visuals here for the panelists. So if you go onto Lobster now, it would be great if you could type in your answer for the poll. So which of the following most accurately describes your course format in the future? So we have the hybrid, the fully online, and the in-person options. And the reason we're including this is also because Lobster has conducted a survey where we asked the same questions and several more on to over 600 instructors across different countries. And I can see there's definitely a strong tendency for a hybrid format, which is interesting. I'll let that populate for a few seconds and move on. Okay, so there's a very strong tendency for a hybrid learning environment from our participants. Now, the next slide here is representing that survey that we did. So this was across over 600 different instructors, and as we can see, which is not totally surprising, that the fully online is vastly represented at the moment, with a few in-person answers as well. The hybrid, interestingly enough, is not looking to change that much, at least based on the survey. And it's very recent. It's from this month. It's from March this year. So interestingly enough, it seems that the in-person and the fully online will swap places, and the the hybrid learning environment is essentially being continued roughly at the same capacity. Another part of the survey was also regarding our which course materials that the instructors would look to use, or sorry, that they are using at the moment. I think the interesting trends for this part of the survey was that there's a heavy reliance on the digital side of things, with of course lab manuals and interestingly quizzes having 77.42%, and I think this really displays that need for engaging the students in a capacity that also speaks to them. So adding that kind of gamification element to the student engagement, and that's obviously been very predominant during the last year, and I think will also be going forward. So without further ado, I will pass you on to my colleague, Sarah Jane, who will be taking over and has questions for the panelists and will participate herself. And please do go into to Slido again and use the hashtag Labster, where we can where your questions will then populate here. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for those awesome introductions, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here and be with the panelists. Really looking forward to the talk we're going to have over the next hour or so. Just to get some context, Josh did a beautiful job of introducing you in terms of your names and institutions, but I just thought we could go around and get a little bit of insight on what it is you teach or what your position is or your role within the universities that you're at. Maybe we could start with Amy.
Hi, so as mentioned, I work at Aston University. I work within the Aston Foundation Centre. I'm just going to be taking over the Programme Director position of the Engineering and Physical Sciences aspect of it. I teach on the chemistry modules and biological and biochemical science modules. I also teach on essential skills, which is giving the students the transferable skills side of things within that programme.
Awesome, thanks so much, Amy. How about you, Teresa? You're muted, sorry. All right, happens to the best of us.
I'm unmuted, apologies.
No problems at all.
So I'm in University College Cork in the School of Food and Nutritional Sciences. So my in terms of teaching, I do quite a bit of teaching with our third year students and even more with our fourth year students, and with our researchers also in instrumentation and that. I've been doing this role for quite a number of years, but I think by way of context, where I came in with Lobster is I did a master's in teaching and learning using Lobster as the topic 3 years ago. So we've had been kind of introducing this element into our teaching program in some form or fashion over the last few years, and as I say, we did quite a large research study on it. So with my third years as guinea pigs. But yeah, well, I think they enjoyed it. So that's the context of why I'm here.
Definitely going to pick you up on that later. If not in this webinar,
yeah, I'm sure you will.
I'm super interested about that. Gavin, how about you? What have you been doing lately?
Hi there. As Josh said, I'm Deputy Head of Life Sciences at Manchester Metropolitan University. So we really started looking at virtual labs in general, and Labster is one of those last summer when everything sort of became fairly obvious that things were going to be very different this academic year. And the reason that we're particularly interested in it is because the main programs that we run in the department are biomedical science, human physiology, human biosciences. In other words, things that involve an awful lot of laboratory time, and all of those programs are accredited from a variety of different PSRBs. So we have a lot of undergraduate students. We also teach foundation level students as well, and we also have master's level students as well. So we've got the wide range of everything that we're teaching there. But just as a bit more context, although I'm here from the Department of Life Sciences, we've also rolled out Labster and some other virtual labs that we use to other departments as well across our Faculty of Science and Engineering. So that includes chemistry, some other natural sciences, as well as sport and exercise science as well. So it's been a very big project this year to look at all of those departments and how Labster and others can help us with that.
It's really interesting to hear that it's got such a broad implementation at your uni at Manchester Met. Oh, I've got so many questions already, but we must introduce Gavin as well.
Cool, thank you very much. So my name is Gavin Knight. I'm a principal lecturer in haematology and I'm a programme leader for biomedical sciences. So I'm the course leader for our undergraduate programme in biomedical science, and I also support the course leaders for our MSc in medical biotechnology and our degree apprenticeship in applied biomedical science as well. We've been using Labster now for perhaps the last 4 or 5 years, perhaps. And we've got an integration with Moodle as our virtual learning environment, which has helped endlessly with how students have accessed Labster from the first days of when they were having to go onto the website and log in. This year, because of the pandemic, we rolled out Labster to move away from just the first year biomedical science students who had access to it originally to our second year BMS students, our applied biomedical science students, and our first year pharmacology as well. And so we've got a bit of a broader uptake this year because of the COVID pandemic.
That's really interesting. That was just a little whoop for pharmacology. That's my specialism. I always get a bit excited whenever I hear it mentioned, so I'm sorry about that.
I'm disappointed you didn't work for biomedical science because it is an outstanding course.
I have no doubt that it is. That's awesome. Oh, well, thanks so much for introducing yourselves, everyone. You've already touched individually a little bit on how you're using virtual labs. I also heard a couple of pointers at some master's level courses and some apprenticeships as well, which I've never really heard of them being implemented in that way. So super interested to hear about them. But I just thought if you would like to share, feel free to jump in. Any favorite kind of teaching methods or how you're using Labster or other virtual labs, either in synergy or independently, how you're using them in classes or how you're using them within your courses. Feel free to share your favorite methodologies.
I can hop in there. Oh, sorry.
No, you go.
I can hop in there briefly because I actually probably forgot to say that our university is we believe, well, it's the first in Ireland, certainly. We actually bought a more or less a global Labster license, so we're using it across 10 different schools and departments at the moment, covering science, engineering, and into medicine and health. So in terms of using it, you name it, we're using it in different ways. In a sense, it's been used, for example, in microbiology to instead of some labs, you know, the kind of bacterial isolation, those simulations. It's been used currently at the moment, which is something we hadn't anticipated at the initially, by pharmacy for what I would call tricky concepts that that they teach. So that would be outside of labs, and that they're finding that very useful. Now, we haven't done it. We will be doing a staff feedback survey on this, because at the moment we have I can't remember. I think we've about 1,900 students actually using Labster between semester 1 and semester 2. And so they're using it as kind of, it's begun to be used as what I've been promoting for the last few years is the use of Labster, not as an instead of, and I'm quite emphatic about that. It does serve us well for some of the topics we teach in food chemistry. For example, there's a simulation for Keldal technique, which is just for measuring protein, but it's a really nasty technique, so we don't let students do it hands-on. But now there's a simulation. So post-COVID, we'll use it for both. We'll show them the instrumentation, but they'll actually learn how to use it effectively using simulation. But so it's been used as a kind of a prerequisite to some lecture material, post some lecture material. So because the other thing, as part of the kind of academic strategy of the university, Labster was always in the background, to be introduced more and more, and this would have been kind of coming from my research and others. What has happened, and what we're kind of trying to be quite clear of to anyone who asks, is that COVID has simply accelerated the process of using Lobster, rather than COVID has sort of caused us to use it. We were introducing it sort of slowly. I mean, for example, the lab safety simulation, we in our school have made mandatory for fourth year students, researchers, postdoctoral researchers who are coming from places that we don't know their experience, and we've made that mandatory, and that's actually been supported by the safety officer of the university. So
that's really interesting.
Yeah. So it's kind of, I saw the question and I kind of thought, well, you name it, we're across medicine and health and science and engineering, we're using it in all sorts of different ways at the moment.
Amy, does that chime with what you were gonna to mention?
Yeah, pretty much. So we actually introduced Lobster to just one of the modules initially. So this was my module, the Biological and Biochemical Sciences Foundation module, because we were struggling to get physical lab space in there, and obviously we still wanted the students to have an opportunity to have some laboratory experience. So it got introduced as that initially. It's been running really nicely and successfully over the past couple of years, and increased to include the chemistry module. But with this, obviously, pandemic coming to place, we spread it across. So there's physics modules in there, there's anatomy and physiology, they've got some mechanical engineering are using it as well. So, and it's kind of, obviously, because of the way that the lockdowns have happened, we have had to have a case of it's been a replacement. But the intention was that it was always something to work alongside it, to expand the students' knowledge. The way we're running it is that it is more of an asynchronous content. So they get given kind of the lecture level content and expand on that, utilising things like your Lobster simulations and the link theory around that as well. So that's been running quite nicely, and it ties into assessments as well, particularly within my module. It definitely does. So it's been working really well.
That's awesome. I like it. Seems like there's been like a real difference. I know, Teresa, you described it as an acceleration, and Amy, you described it almost like a prerequisite. This idea that in some cases where you've got particularly dangerous protocols, or where there might be a health and safety risk, or where space just simply allows, you can still allow a student to become familiar with the protocols and the procedures and the equipment, which has utility within a replacement scenario, I imagine, like Teresa. But I guess the cognitive load reduction in kind of having a student know what a HPLC looks like, or know what a boiling flask is before they actually come into the lab, means it's one less thing for them to have to like put new eyes onto. How about you, Gavin? I saw you doing a lot of nodding in the background there, so I was wondering, have you got any favourite ways to use virtual labs in your course?
We use them quite a lot with our first year students within our key skills in biomedical science, or for biomedical scientists rather, which is a 40 credit first year module. And so we use that to consolidate what students are learning and what they're doing in the physical labs anyway. And certainly we're doing perhaps more consolidation since COVID than perhaps pre-COVID. But what we do is to encourage students to engage with the labs, the simulations, we actually get them to reflect on their experiences as part of a portfolio that they submit. So they provide an archive, if you like, of all the marks they've got, and they talk about what learning experiences they've had as part of their engagement with Lobster. And I think what's particularly important with our first years as well, our admissions criteria are such that we don't ask for chemistry as a mandatory subject when they join biomedical science. So there's quite a lot of chemistry they have to do in the first year then to bring them all up to the same kind of standard level. And so we use a lot of the chemistry modules that you've got within labs to consolidate then what's taught academically. And that works really well. And where you've got a subject that is, for some, particularly quite challenging, not only going through the lectures and using screencasts and other things, but then having those labs to simulations they can link in with and watch and interact with, I think is a fantastic resource.
That's such an interesting concept. So the consolidation, also like just going full cold with implementing Lobster in your course. I love it, without being too much of a pedagogy nerd. I imagine, so A-levels are so in depth, we do so few subjects when we do our A-levels, whereas, for example, in the international baccalaureate courses or elsewhere, when we've got students coming over perhaps from other countries to study in the UK, there's not always that synergy and alignment with prerequisite experience. So it's really interesting to hear that you could almost backfill some of those gaps that are coming kind of pre-18 to ensure that everybody's ready at first year to progress together within the course.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our degree apprenticeship as well, you know, the idea behind the degree apprenticeship is that we upskill existing staff that work in the NHS, maybe as you know, medical laboratory assistants, to work up to getting to a position where they can register with Healthcare Professions Council. They have very varied academic backgrounds. And so rather than forcing people down a traditional academic route where it might not necessarily be appropriate for them, perhaps they're mature students, they can't afford to take time away from their job in order to go and do an A-level or something else. You know, this works really nicely, and you know, it just works across the board really. So even those students that have passed A-level chemistry, you know, still benefit from going through this process and you know, revising using this sort of approach. It's just a different way of thinking, and I think it works very well.
You've mentioned accreditation there, which is something I kind of wanted to raise up with Gavin as well. Oh, should I do it now? Should I come back to it? Gavin, I wanted to ask from, you've got more of a kind of line manager perspective as opposed to like frontline teaching. I wondered, for you and the educators that you're working with, have they responded well to like implementing virtual labs within their courses, or is it something you've kind of observed pushback to?
If I'm perfectly honest, back when we started this last summer, it was sort of a mixture of both. You know, there are some people who are very happy about having to bring these sort of solutions in. Others were a little bit more reticent, if I'm honest. But fairly quickly, almost everybody has now realised just how useful these sort of resources can be.
Yeah.
So at the moment, I'm not getting any questions about how do I use this. It's more, are we still going to have it next year?
We're the same.
You know, which is good.
That's awesome.
Just in terms of how we go about using it, I just sort of agree with what everybody else has said. You know, it's a very flexible thing that you can do. So one of our main worries last summer was that, well, not so much a worry, but it was one of our things that we were considering was, well, we have very large cohorts of students. So last year we ended up with 300 odd biomeds coming into our first year program. And because of the social distancing guidelines that we've been working with all year, even when we were allowed on campus, we were working in groups of 16 students. So we were basically delivering the same practical 27 times, whereas normally we would do it 3 or 4, given the size of the labs. So for those students, we've very much been using virtual labs as a replacement for some activities. Whereas for other years, we've been using it as an asynchronous activity to help with lectures, lecture knowledge, as Amy mentioned. But for our master's students, we've largely just been letting them use it as and when they want. So similar to what Gavin said there about consolidating, you know, a lot of these MSc students will have come through different degree pathways, and we've basically given them the opportunity to interact with those to practice what they've learned previously, or if they haven't done that as part of a previous degree, then they've got the opportunity to learn it before they come in and do any projects or anything like that. So it is something that you can use in a very flexible manner, depending on what you want to achieve from it. There's no sort of set way of doing these things.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of benefit in this kind of revisionary consolidation, recall prior knowledge and extension kind of areas. I wonder, do any of you use Lobster in conjunction with other virtual or OER resources? I know of one person who has been combining ADI systems for physiology with Lobster in terms of exercise physiology, which I definitely want to hit them up and find out more about that anyway. But I wondered if any of you have had experiences with combining the virtual labs like Lobster with other OERs.
Yes, yeah, we have. We invested in 3 different options last summer, which the purpose of that was that, you know, each of those had their different strengths effectively. So by investing in all 3 of them, then we could cover pretty much everything across the faculty that we were really we were very interested in at the time. So yeah, we do have experience of that. the main lesson from that is they all work very, very differently, which is good in a way. You don't want to continue using the same thing over and over and over again. PowerPoint at one point was a fantastic innovation, and now it's whole death by PowerPoint thing going on. So it is good to have that variety, but there is certainly some issues when you start chopping and changing between different solutions, because people, not just staff but students, also need to learn how to interact with those different systems.
I can see Amy strongly agreeing there.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a case for, if you've got too much software on the go, that students can disengage with the whole process. So it's better to have them familiarised with something that that they're comfortable with, and staff are comfortable with utilising as well. We don't use anything else within our department, but I do know that another department has subscribe to another software as well, but their leaning is more towards this in terms of the experience that it provides for students.
It's really, it's good to hear about different implementation strategies. There's things that Lobster does really well, and there's other technologies that just provide a different insight, like for example ADI being able to take actual physical data from people and then kind of consolidate the knowledge within something like the exercise physiology lab, or indeed like have the help of interpreting the data through understanding what's going on without having to read yet another handbook or go through another set of slides. Can be interesting. So a couple of people have touched on accreditation, and I did really want to ask about how restrictions have impacted the design and the delivery of a curriculum, not necessarily just the individual teaching itself, but more the long-term strategy of how to deliver knowledge over the continuum of a course or the continuum of the program. But also, are you seeing or anticipating any impact as we've shifted to digital a little bit more for this time period? Are you experiencing any issues or challenges around degree accreditation, whether or not the experience is commensurate? So I guess the question is twofold. Have you seen impact for your curriculum, and do you anticipate that will have impact and knock-on effect for your accreditation of your degree? I know Gavin mentioned, is it RSB?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. And all of our degrees in life sciences have RSB, or Royal Society of Biology accreditation. And one of the big things that they promote is lab competencies. But our biomedical science course also has IBMS accreditation as well, which is a different thing for a different reason. In terms of how lockdown has sort of impacted the design of the curriculum, it hasn't to any great extent, other than we changed our academic calendar effectively. So we used to run things in a long, thin manner throughout the year, and then we consolidate that now into 6-week blocks. That's a university-wide decision to help if there was local lockdowns for whatever reason, as it did turn out there was. In terms of delivery of the curriculum, the big thing, as I kind of mentioned, is the practical skills that come with the competencies for Royal Society of Biology. So I guess what we've tried to do is design our on-campus lab activities that we've been able to do to be more about learning practical skills rather than experiments, so to speak. Whereas in the past, you might come in and do an experiment on one particular technique, if you like. So you mentioned exercise physiology. We get people exercising versus lying down and measuring blood pressure and metabolic rate and things like that. Whereas now the focus is far more on what that skill is and whether or not a student is able to actually do that or not. But in terms of how it affects our accreditation, we actually went through a re-accreditation process in February. We had our visit with the RSB, and we were, don't mind admitting, slightly concerned about what they would say, given that we've had to go through lockdown and so on. But actually, they were very, very supportive of what we brought in terms of the virtual lab environments that we've offered. So they were perfectly happy with, and actually very complimentary that we've been able to still offer some on-campus experience, but we've also been able to facilitate learning other things that we haven't been able to do through these virtual environments.
I'm really glad to hear that. That RSB accreditation was a tricky thing to navigate when I was a lecturer. many moons ago. So it's really encouraging to hear that they were complimentary. And Gavin, yeah, you mentioned about your healthcare as well. For your
Yeah, I was just going to step in actually and say the same as Gavin actually. So we've got Royal Society of Biology accreditation and accreditation with the IBMS as well. And it's we were concerned when lockdown started how we'd still get to ensure that students had competence in the techniques, and not knowing how long it was going to last as well. I think the first lockdown, which was pretty much a year ago, we were thinking it might be a few weeks and then that would be it. And a year later, we're still kind of in this odd situation. So what we did was we were given flexibility to change our modules a little bit. We've just been through a curriculum framework change, which took all of our modules, which were, apart from when you had exemptions, long and thin, and we changed them broadly to short, fat modules, which I won't go into too much detail about, but it was a challenge to try to shrink everything down. And then we managed to kind of bring things back to long and thin in certain situations so that we had that flexibility around lab classes and bringing students back in. I think for us, the main concern was where we had practically orientated learning outcomes for our modules. Getting students to pass those modules when it said that you would be able to do certain practical things when we couldn't guarantee that they'd be back on site and be able to, well, perhaps even in the country, and be able to engage in those lab classes. So what we did was we decided to, quite rightly, I think in retrospect, leave the program aims as they were in the outcomes, but to change the learning outcomes with the modules to make them more theoretical so they could we could ensure that they would meet those outcomes regardless of what situation we found ourselves in with COVID, with the expectation that when we're putting our module amendment forms later on in the year for next year, we then bring those back. And so our plan is for our timetabling next year to then duplicate those lab classes we've run this year as a consolidation for those that have done it already. For those that haven't done it, then this is their chance to do those lab classes.
And develop the manual skills.
And develop those manual skills, so they've got that technical mastery that they can still do. And the final years, unfortunately, haven't had an opportunity to be in the lab this year, which is a shame. But they had done most of their lab classes, they've done all of their lab classes in year 1 and year 2 anyway, and so they've already got those technical skills, so we weren't too worried about them. And we've used labs to again show that students what opportunities there are within the labs, what techniques are available, what sort of technologies you can use in a physical environment. And so it's very much about showing students what is available and what we can do in a lab when they might not necessarily have been on site for the whole year. We've got our Royal Society of Biology reaccreditation coming up in the imminent future, and so it's really comforting to hear what Gavin has said about them actually being supportive of using Lobster, which we have done, but obviously we do want to get students back on site. I think one of the other challenges that we had as well was when the government and Michelle Donlan wrote a letter to say, these are the universities that can carry on and run run courses face to face. Biomedical science wasn't explicitly on that list, which was a little bit of a challenge for us. And so we did ensure that students stayed remote until HUTBUMS, heads of university centres for biomedical science, managed to ballot the government and get biomedical science put on the list, at which point we then brought as many of them as we could back, but on an optional basis rather than a mandatory basis.
Is your biomedical science courses IBMS or RSB accredited?
Both.
Both? Oh, wowzer, check you out. That one. Teresa, I saw a lot of nodding there. Is that kind of chiming with some things for you and your courses?
I'm actually intrigued by this because yeah, it is absolutely in answer to your question, but we would be in the same position, but we spent and we actually have a big school meeting coming up today at 1:15 on the topic for next semester. We spent a lot of time and a lot of my colleagues were very heavily involved all of last summer because we could see where Ireland was going with COVID, recording everything that we did. And like Gavin is saying, we brought in, what I mean is everything we did in the labs, as well as obviously recording lecture material in that. But so we did prioritize in between September and the end of November, because our lockdown was sort of allowing us to do that. We brought in our second year classes, and one of my colleagues really did a lot of work in creating classes within COVID guidelines, because we've quite large classes, and we repeated them and that. So they got good experience. Our third years came in for some, but for every single thing we did, we recorded, because this time last year when we went into lockdown, we had 2 hours notice to actually pack up and leave the university. And we were afraid when we saw the COVID numbers going completely mad in Ireland post-Christmas, because the Irish do party, it is true what they say, we were afraid that would happen again. And it largely did, except I'm in work for under critical research guidelines, but we're allowed to come in for, that's probably it actually at the moment. We don't have any undergrad classes. So we spent a lot of time recording every single laboratory technique. And then, so we use the recordings, we use Lobster, which has been able to, supplement some of the skills, not all of them, obviously, because Lobster doesn't have a simulation for everything that we teach. And then, like Gavin is saying, our fourth years were not 100% concerned about, because they have had the second and third year experience. But the experience they get in product development, it's almost like a dragon's den that we do with them, because we have a big pilot plant processing facility also. They're going to miss that largely, so that's kind of a shame. But
so we need Alan Sugar in a simulation. That's what I'm hearing.
yeah, exactly. But so we spent a lot of time before this current academic year started recording, and it's still ongoing. When we discovered recently we couldn't bring third years in for some of our other processing workshops that we do, which are kind of go beyond that of a lab. Where they're currently recording those, and so we're limping our way to the end. But the interesting thing is, we will draw on those recordings again. We kind of know that, and for our fourth years, we're using the ones we made. The third year recordings we're making available to them where appropriate, if they want to upskill in certain areas for their projects. So it's kind of just moving things around and balancing it. So we're kind of, I'll be interested to see what my colleagues say now when we meet at 1:15 today, but we're sort of preparing ourselves for next year, because we're unsure what semester one is going to look like next year. We're really unsure. I think it'll be more on-site teaching, but I think we're still going to be under COVID guidelines of social distancing and mask wearing. So we're kind of thinking around that at the moment. I think people have come to the realization that the pandemic isn't going to end as quickly as we would have liked. We left on the 12th of March last year for what we thought was 3 weeks.
Right. And those pool cells need transferring to the liquid nitrogen. I hope they have been. Maybe we need to make some simulations around how to successfully bring your cells back from the dead after accidentally forgetting to put them in liquid nitrogen.
So we've learned a lot, but we're, kind of now in a position to look more positively at a similar, well, not as bad scenario come semester one of next year.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear that now is the time. Well, I guess it always is, isn't it? Easter time, you start planning ahead for October, if you haven't already. Exactly. And I'm hoping that there's a place for virtual resources, not just Lobster, but other virtual OER resources as well in the future going forward, because it sounds like there's actually been some unanticipated educational benefit kind of highlighted a little bit. which is really encouraging to hear. I wondered if I might come back to something that both Gethin and Gavin highlighted, this kind of reduction of courses, not reduction, but repackaging courses as rather than being long and skinny, where I'd imagine multiple modules are running side by side, to rather than being in the 6-week blocks, as Gethin said, or short and fat, as Gavin said, which are both beautiful descriptions of how the same kind of approach has been pulled together. I remember when I was teaching myself, we always had this dilemma of long and skinny versus short and fat, and how to interconnect knowledge from different modules. And to me, kind of virtual resources represent an opportunity to really cross the streams in different modules. So I wondered if that's something that you were doing or planning, or if you've got a strategy to ensure that the modules are connected in an integrated way as the student kind of progresses constructively through the degree program. If anyone has any ideas on how that might be done.
Yeah, I'm happy to step in here. So, you know, when we designed our biomedical science program, we've been through a number of iterations. Biomedical science in Portsmouth has been running for about 43 years now. So it's an old course. And, you know, to keep it alive and keep it moving and keep it contemporary, you know, you've got to think about how students learn. And so I think technology in many respects has been a real blessing here. I think ultimately what's really important is that as a course team, you sit down and you look at your program design and everyone is invested in it and they can see how you can operate a spiral curriculum in such a way that people understand where their part is in the bigger picture or in the jigsaw. And so I think having that communication is really important. I think, you know, one of the challenges that we face is where, because we've expanded our numbers really rapidly over the last 3 or 4 years. You know, we used to have a course with 60 students in the final year, and for us that was plenty, and now we're 100 on top of that, so we're 160 per year, 150 per year. So we've brought in tutors from other parts of the School of Pharmacy and Biomedical Sciences. As such, those tutors aren't necessarily an expert or have been involved in those discussions about how the spiral curriculum works. And so it is a challenge sometimes to get those tutors who are new to the biomedical science area to really engage fully with how the course aligns with and crossover occurs between modules. So that's been the challenge, I think, but having that communication is really important.
Yeah.
We have kind of, especially because we have quite a tight team, we see a lot of cross-curricular linkage and make sure that we do have that. So from the maths modules that the students have, we make sure that they tie into the other modules that are, more pathway specific for them. So, whether it's the mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, ESM based stuff, we've tied in specific modules and tailored them to be appropriate for those pathways as well. And making sure that they do see those crossovers. So the essential skills module sometimes gets kind of passed off as, oh, why we're doing it. It gets brought in with all the other modules as well to be like, look, this is why we do this. This is why this is important. And you can see that consistently across the program, which is really nice. But yeah, it is crucial that that kind of takes place to make sure that you're not seeing lots of replication across different modules as well, because that is a worry. We had a shift not last year before, full program restructure. So we went from having some that were short and fat modules, some were long and thin, to everything being short and fat. But the pathway modules were kind of split in half. So you'd have the one in the first teaching period, the one in the second, and you can see that development as they progress into those different modules as well. And still being able to access the modules of the previous ones that they can build on, and they can see that they actually do build from that initial content to the new content as well.
This is really interesting. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you there. My brain is ablaze from listening to the four of you talk, but I'm kind of seeing almost like two different types of virtual content that actually would have utility for certainly the four of you, almost as Gethin raised before, being able to demonstrate mastery in a particular skill, not necessarily in a story-based scenario or experimental scenario, but do you know how to work this bit of equipment? So like, individual focused, technique based, but then also a more capstone experience that perhaps does pull the maths of why we test concrete in a certain way, or the statistics behind a particular type of psychological testing, or a gene linkage analysis or something like that. So it's almost as if there seems to be two different components or two different things that need to be satisfied, or that would have utility within curricula. I'm just going to take that one back for when I have to do my next alignment next week, for when we're making new content. That's really, really insightful. Thank you. Yeah, how about you, Teresa? Is this something that you're experiencing? Kind of like, I know students, you've mentioned about students demonstrating mastery in the course, but are you finding that the linkage between different subjects is something that's a challenge with digital or virtual learning?
Actually, one thing that came to mind, which is slightly off what you're asking me, when we introduced Lobster, and as I say, this was on a really large scale in the university back in September, we we had a situation where, because obviously our students, we have our modules, but they also take microbiology modules or whatever. We were kind of fighting over who'd take what Lobster simulation. So there's one we use a lot, and I had actually started using it myself 3 years ago, the Introduction to Food Macromolecules.
Yeah.
But microbiology students cover food macromolecules, not to obviously the same extent as our students, because that's what we teach. And I wanted to use it and they wanted to use it. But biochemistry, which is a huge department in our school, or sorry, in our college, they also wanted to use it. So we had to actually, we started off, which worked really well. I don't know if the others have done it. We formed a Lobster group. I chair the Lobster working group of the university. Now it's just a working group. I thought it would die a death once we embedded the Lobster simulations, that it would kind of last into maybe November or something. But it turned out that it actually got to be quite busy, and we do have to meet fairly regularly. What we'll be doing now is looking at the future of Lobster for the next academic year. But and things like that came up a lot, people wanting to embed it in their course. We didn't want students to be doing it twice, so we had to be really careful how we introduced it. And you also had to decide, was it more appropriate for a particular discipline within the college or another? So the Lobster issue became quite interesting. So we had to sort of move it around. But that's slightly off. I know the question you asked, but it just came to mind as I was just curious. Did other people have the same issue?
Just to highlight, it's funny you should mention Introduction to Food Macromolecules, because it's one of our most popular simulations.
It's
so
one of
much
the longest, so, yeah.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, it's super long. But launching soon are 4 adaptations of that simulation that kind of split out and highlight the 4 different tests you do. So simple carbs, complex carbs, protein and lipids.
That's a good idea.
So you can just do them in isolation, and then you can do the capstone full experience if you wanted to, just to kind of give more flexibility to educators. So it's interesting to hear that simulation in particular, because it's feedback that we've received.
It's proven to be one of the most used ones. Now I need to go into the data we have been gathering to check exactly that, but it's proven to be one of the more used ones, because food macromolecules covers it. I mean, we part of our school is nutritional sciences, so they've used it, but it goes right into pharmacy, biochemistry, and some of the other disciplines who are using Lobster. It's one of the longer ones, and splitting it up actually for me would be almost really good as well, because when I do protein, carbohydrates and fat chemistry with students, I do them separately. And I'm always trying to figure out which one to introduce that particular simulation at. But that will be useful. It's one of the more challenging simulations, but the students actually really like it because they do learn a lot. I think
Well,
I
there
got
you
a
go.
question. I got a question wrong once doing it. Not a second time. Not a
I'm
second
fretting
time.
that it's actually us that have got the question.
No. And it was
I'm imagining
Well,
like academics having fisticuffs over which simulations they want to use in their courses, and this makes me incredidly
yeah,
happy for schools.
it was something I hadn't anticipated that happening, but we
Sure.
just had to you know, kind of align the simulation with the
Yeah.
primary user, and then, you know, and make sure, because our students overlap. Our students take microbiology, biochemistry, and so on. So, you know, as more minor modules. So it was an interesting thing that I didn't anticipate happening, but we worked it out.
Is this
I
something
think.
that happens in other places too? Do we need to have Battle Royale Lobster? Like,
Yeah, that's an issue that we've had. Yeah,
Oh,
you
good.
know,
Oh, good.
we didn't put a group together. We put one or two people who were basically in charge of sorting that out. But yeah, it is an issue, because you don't want students doing the same simulation 4 times. You know,
Yeah.
that would kind of negate the whole point of doing it in the first place, and the experience that they get. So it certainly is an issue. I think moving forward for us, I'm slightly more concerned about making sure that we don't have next year's second years doing the same stuff as they did in first year,
makes sense.
because we have used it quite
Yeah,
heavily there.
very true. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
with us in biomedical science in Portsmouth, I run the technology enhanced learning group for the School of Pharmacy and Biomedical Sciences, and so, you know, Labster kind of fits under that umbrella. Alex came along a few weeks ago and did an introductory session to Labster for some of the staff that don't usually use it, and that was incredibly useful. And I think, you know, where you know, pharmacology have started using it for the first time this year, perhaps they haven't quite got the signposting right. And so, you know, I don't think necessarily where we've got modules with multiple people delivering material, or we're creating content for those modules, I don't know they've necessarily signposted it in the right way. So I think, you know, we do need to change our approach for next year to make sure that, you know, we do end up in a situation where the usage is great across all the modules and both of the programs there.
I get that. I remember myself teaching on the pharmacology module. It's a perennial issue of like, the university has discovered something cool, and it's not in the learning objectives of any one particular lecture, but suddenly it's repeated in everyone just because it's this interesting thing that's come up, right? Yeah. And then EVASys is like, it's too repetitive. I hate EVASys. I don't. It's brilliant. It's an excellent tool, but I don't like reading my EVASys feedback. It's scary. So we've only got a few minutes left, and I really wanted to kind of round off with one final question, which is around what your biggest lessons have been. But we do have this one that has popped up. So, are you able to incorporate writing or observations from simulations to determine the student's abilities to collect observations? So I guess this question is around reflection. Are you able to incorporate the students' reflections on the simulations into future learning or reflection? Could probably have a quick answer to that one alongside your top learning, if you would like.
We get students to reflect on their approaches using Labster within our first year module. I mean, it's an interesting one about looking at their observations and how to communicate with them, and that's not necessarily something that we do there, but we do look at how they're able to use the reflective cycle approach to learn how to consolidate using Labster, and then how they can improve on their experience in the future, which will help them with their study skills. So I guess that's probably more the approach that we've used in Portsmouth.
Sure thing. That makes sense.
So with the chemistry module, part of their assessment is writing lab reports. Now, ideally, we would have been in a lab to run experiments for them to be able to collect data to do that side of things. What we've been doing for that particular assessment is actually tying in some of the Labster simulations as well, so they are able to utilize the Labster simulations to assist in creating this lab report assessment as well. So we kind of do an amalgamation between the simulation and then us having provided information around the protocols that they'd be running and giving sort of images or videos of results and how they got them. So we've kind of done it in combination as opposed to just fully utilising that simulation.
That makes sense, yeah. And I guess the more things that a student's able to provide critique on, the richer the experience for them, and the more holistic the reflection too. And being able to join those dots and develop the soft skills needed to join the dots is super important, of course. Okay, then I shall ask my final question, as we have 5 minutes left of the session pretty much. So if you could, what has been your #1 learning that you're going to take forward into the post-COVID world, the post-COVID utopia that we're all looking forward to so much with regards to digital resources?
I think it's going to be a combination of the importance of asynchronous and synchronous. It doesn't have to be a fully synchronous approach. And actually, for a lot of students, having this combination is really, really beneficial because of the provision of flexibility. As Gavin said, you know, you've got students that are mature students there, or that have caring responsibilities and things like that, which are obviously going to impact on their ability to attend synchronous and have fully synchronous experiences. So if you've got content that is useful, that is asynchronous as well, then obviously they can dip in and out. And obviously if you provide recordings of the synchronous side of things as well, then they've got full access to everything. So you are providing equality across the board for a cohort, which is definitely something we're taking forward.
That's
exactly the experience in our university. I was telling Joshua this webinar was actually very well timed in a sense, because we had a very large in-house within UCC seminar last Friday afternoon on this very topic. So it was literally from top down speaking at it, and that's and they use Slido like this for questions, and that when they were polling staff right across the university, there was a huge attendance at it. That's exactly what came out. And also in handling very large classes, I mean, for a small city, we've got actually a very large university and our student numbers are rising continuously. The idea of the asynchronous versus synchronous and the option of going into a lecture theatre with 400 people, whereas, you know, if it's live online also, they're kind of looking at that. So I think it's been a huge benefit in a sense of the pandemic, where we're now looking at ways of teaching, as Amy is saying, that will work going forward. And the percentage of people at the seminar last Friday was very high, favouring this type of system going forward. But the university were very clear in pointing out, and our Vice President of Teaching and Learning, that we will always be an on-campus, in-house teaching facility. The ethos is not to go forward as an online, and I 100% support that. But
I wish we had more time to talk about the culture and embedding kind of institutional identity and institutional culture within online digital spaces, which was, just give us another hour to talk. How about you, Gavin? Do you have any final thoughts, final best learnings?
I think I just agree with everything that Amy and Therese have said there. For me, I think that the biggest thing is what we already knew, but we've actually been able to do this year, which is trying stuff is actually good. You know, we work in a culture where, you know, you want to change stuff, but there's a bit of risk involved in that. Whereas this year, it's kind of been forced on us. You know, you had to do things differently this year. Some of that has worked, and some of it probably hasn't. And similarly, before that, before the pandemic, some of the stuff we did then worked, and some of it didn't work particularly well. We now have an opportunity to put those two things together and take the best of both of those worlds. So I completely agree that we shouldn't, unless you work for certain organisations, I don't think you particularly want to become an online-only university. But at the same time, we can use that time that we have on campus in a far better way than we have in the past, by incorporating what worked then with what we know works from a virtual side of things.
That makes so much sense. Like, yeah, we've got so much room for optimization. Maybe virtual labs are part of that solution. How about you, Gavin? Final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Amy, Gethin, and Teresa have said. You know, it's absolutely that. I mean, I would say that for both staff and students, an appropriate scaffold needs to be put in place so that, you know, staff feel that they're supported when they're developing new materials and they're using a blended and connected approach. Students are supported to learn how to learn in new ways, which maybe they won't have necessarily experienced before. Using the student voice as a way to ensure that we're getting it right. You know, what we think is right, maybe as educators, might not necessarily be ticking the box for the students, and so working, you know, alongside them to make sure that we are getting it right. And also, you know, not giving up. You know, I know staff have been at the point where they just wanted to say, look, you know, I just want to go back. I just want to, you know, forget about this whole, you know, short recordings, 15 minutes, doing transcriptions and everything else. And I'm just going to do an hour's lecture live. And actually, you know, don't give up. Just keep trying it, keep refining it, and you know, you'll get there in the end. And I think it's about building resilience between both staff and student bodies to make sure that we do stick with it and we give students the best approach possible.
I love that. I love that rounding out of, like, you know, give something a try, be flexible, learn from your mistakes, learn from just, you know, what you can do better next time. And I'm so encouraged to hear the four of you and the institutions that you represent and have been so open to giving things a try. As Teresa's also highlighted, sometimes it is just a case of accelerating a change that was going to happen anyway, rather than feeling forced to have to pivot and do something innovative. Like, there's room for both approaches. So I think we're pretty much at time. I have had the most wonderful time talking to you. It's rare that I get to flex the little pedagogic curriculum design muscles with people that are actually in institutions. So thank you so much for spending the time with me to do that, and also for helping me live my any questions, any answers dream, my Radio 4 dream. I'm not sure if Josh is going to pop back just to help us say our goodbyes. There he is, as if by magic. Yeah, but this has been a fantastic session for me. Thanks so much for sharing.
Yeah, big, as we've just gone a few minutes past the hour, a big thank you to all of the panelists. We really appreciate your insights and you taking your time to come and speak with us and amongst yourselves as well and address the questions from the audience. And also a big thank you to all of the participants for coming in and attending the webinar. We hope you find it as interesting and as useful as we do at Lobster. And on a final note, I will say that the webinar has been recorded, so we'll send out the recording to everyone. So you can look for that. You can find that with the email that you registered with for the beginning of next week. Thank you very much and have a wonderful weekend.
See you later, everyone. Thanks again.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.